All men have the right to an environment capable of sustaining life and promoting happiness. If the accumulated actions of the past become destructive of this right, men now living have the further right to repudiate the past for the benefit of the future. And it is manifest that centuries of careless neglect of the environment have brought mankind to a final crossroads. The quality of our lives is eroded and our very existence threatened by our abuse of the natural world.
January 28th, 1969 was a day to remember, a time to remember.
As I was hovering in a plane looking down on what looked like a black artesian well pouring out of the ocean, I just kept thinking that this was, I was looking at something that was going to change the world's approach to living.
It just kept pouring out, the oil, and then they would report that it had been capped and everything was going to be fine. Then it'd blow again.
So we were waiting for it, and people came down to the beach, and sure enough, as Bob Easton said, it was a black tide. And here it came.
I think once it started fouling the harbor area, all the commercial and private boats in there, and then it really became quite a deal.
And we saw the birds covered with oil, and we saw the oil piled up on the boats in the harbor and on the beaches, and we began to realize that it was a lot more extensive than just a small source, that this was going to be a very large spill.
And people would go to the beach, they couldn't believe what they were looking at. The once beautiful ocean, it was really a wonderful place to be. And the beaches, the best in the world, were black. And there was, the shocking thing, there was no noise from the ocean. You couldn't hear the ocean. And of course the smell was gone. Now all you could smell was oil.
There really wasn't a way to stop the spill. The only reason it stopped and tapered off was that it ran out of oil. In other words, everything came up and spilled.
What the oil spill did was to alert people to the environment. So it's known as the spill that was heard around the world.
It seemed to strike a chord, like, well, I wanted to do something about this.
I was so disturbed, I screamed out, "We gotta get oil out!" And my boss, who was in the next office, poked his head around the corner and said, "Yeah, get oil out, goo, good name." So we thought, we'll have a petition drive, and enough people sign this thing, we can get rid of the oil companies out in the channel. You know, we didn't know who we were up against.
There are certain events in history that I call shockers. And shockers are events that galvanize public attention to an issue, change the way public thinks about an issue. And the Santa Barbara oil spill was one of those events.
I think the times, those times triggered a lot of young people to think in somewhat non-conventional ways.
This would be a great opportunity. You know what? We really could start a movement here. Let's hope it starts everywhere.
This spill had a national impact right from the start.
Shortly thereafter, for the first time, environmental studies. This is a course that has changed the playbook.
The first thing that happened after the oil spill was the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act, and then the next year all the other laws started being prepared, like the Clean Air Act and Endangered Species Act and Clean Water Act and Coastal Zone Management Act.
So Santa Barbara made a dent, a big one.
If you don't know your history, you're destined to repeat it. In other words, the bad things, if you can't remember what they were, you're going to go ahead and more than likely do some bad things because you don't know what the repercussion of it would be. And that's the importance of history. It teaches us how to behave.
I think that historically we're cyclical. They move on an as-needed basis.
And as we know now, looking back, we planned a consumer economy after the war. We need to keep consuming things. We need to keep consuming things. In other words, we became, materialists.
We're in a crisis. And then the question is, what do you do in a crisis? You can, if you have a vision, you can possibly use the crisis as a moment of opportunity to get traction on a new direction.
How about replacing an energy-intensive lifestyle, an energy-too-much lifestyle, with a less? How about less is more? So I don't like the concept of energy crisis as finding ways that we can keep our fat cat lifestyle going.
All this stuff that led to the collapse. It's all consumerism. It's all that stuff. All that mortgage packaging and all that stuff, that's all fed by a materialist, and not in a religious sense, but an idea that we're consumers. We're not consumers, we're citizens.
We're at a tipping point with climate change. We have to make the right decisions now or it will be too late. We're at a tipping point in terms of our energy future. If we continue to commit to oil production or coal, or if we go down the path of liquefied natural gas, all those choices have an everlasting effect. If you make a commitment to those kind of energy choices, you've locked us in for 40 or 50 years, and it's impossible to make the same advances with renewable energy. So we're at that path right now, whether you care about the environment or energy or national security or jobs, we have to make the right decision now, and people need to understand that we can't wait anymore.
You will not be unscathed by what is coming, and denial will not obviate the need for action.
I would suggest that it is imperative that the younger generation, the students today, the high school students and the university students, that they be committed, because it's what they're going to be dealing with in a few years.
Do something. If everyone sits to the side and says, I'm going to let someone else deal with it, it's not going to happen.
I want people to participate. Show a difference, make a difference in this community.
Let's really be wise, let's be sapient apes, and let's try to make these changes before the collapse occurs, before the shocker occurs. Let's be smart now, before the iceberg hits the Titanic.
So no matter what you do on Mother Earth, you have to think about, what about the generations down the line now? What are we leaving them? What's our legacy? What's our legacy? What are we going to give our kids? Isn't that the most important thing you can imagine? Or what are we leaving our children? We want a better world for them than the one we had.
This movie is dedicated in the loving memory of James Bud Bottoms, whose creative protests help inspire a movement, whose art helped bring beauty to Santa Barbara and beyond, and whose dedication to the natural world left a legacy that will live on for generations.